This grand Greek Revival building is the renowned British Museum. Each year it attracts millions of visitors who come to see the world's rarest treasures. One of them is the Rosetta Stone. In the past, scholars had no way of understanding ancient Egyptian civilization because no one could read the complicated hieroglyphs. The inscriptions on the stone were produced in 196 BC with the same text in 3 different scripts. Experts compared the scripts and deciphered the hieroglyphs, whose meanings had been lost for thousands of years. More than 2,000 years later, a young girl saw it, and her eyes lit up.
I came into this world of China in a funny way. I came to it through the Rosetta Stone.
Jessica Rawson is a professor of Chinese art and archaeology at the University of Oxford. She specializes in Chinese bronze and jade. She focuses on the cultural exchanges between China and Central Asia. She won the Tong Prize in 2022 for her wide-ranging perspectives and precise interpretations. Her education started 70 years ago when she stood before the Rosetta Stone.
I was taken to the British Museum when I was about 9 or 10, and I think my parents were bored with me and needed to occupy me. They didn't think they were starting me on a whole new existence. But they took me to the Rosetta Stone, which has 3 languages on it. What really interested me were the hieroglyphics. You could write in a different way, and I find writing and spelling difficult, so I thought, well, maybe this would help.
She found reading English difficult in her childhood, but has always been in tune with images. She learned that languages do not have to be phonetic. Ideographic symbols like birds and the sun can also be used for communication. She grew up in London and often visited antique shops with her family. Artifacts from China and Japan always attracted her attention. In 1961, she joined an archaeology team in Jerusalem for a short period of excavation. The project was overseen by renowned archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon. They found a large amount of Chinese porcelain in the Middle East. This interaction between 2 places far from each other roused her curiosity, and this trip started her on a journey into the world of archaeological objects.
I find Chinese characters more illuminating than English spelling, but I don't have any trouble with identifying objects. And I found then, and I was only 18, that I was one of the quickest at learning this pottery stuff. I could identify them almost immediately. That's where I learned about Chinese trade, about the very different texture of Chinese ceramics from these early Bronze Age and Iron Age Palestine ceramics. It was an amazingly eye-opening experience. And I think from that moment on, I've been fearless about handling or identifying objects.
Sinologists in the past focused mainly on culture, history, philosophy, and the interpretation of texts and literature. Professor Rawson is known for her expertise in art history and material culture studies, and she focuses on excavated artifacts. In her eyes, artifacts may remain silent, but they speak to her. The texture, shapes, decorations, and every detail show the lifestyles, cultures, traditions, and even the geographical conditions people lived in.
Objects are telling you what they're for. First of all, they're just telling you the function. But if you look a little harder and think a little more about it, you see, particularly at high table where the academics are sitting, the knives and forks are in silver. And in front of the people at night is a candlestick in silver. And then you realize that the silver is part of that language. In our lives, silver matters, whereas in your lives in China, it will matter less because you use chopsticks. So the materials you use for your eating are quite different from ours. And so if I start to compare China and the West, I can see they're 2 different languages.
Let's now take a look at archaeological sites. There are two Chinese tombs from the same period. One is located in modern Beijing. A vast amount of bronze ritual artifacts were unearthed. The other is located on the outskirts of Beijing. It contained horse tack, knives, and daggers as grave goods.
What is the language of the objects telling me? It's telling me two things. It's telling me that there are two different populations quite near each other in northern China, but they live different lifestyles. And in the case of the man buried in the main part of the 1000 to 800 BC region dominated by the Zhou dynasty, they offer formal banquets to their ancestors. But the man near Beijing doesn't have any ritual vessels, so he doesn't have the same belief system. He belongs to a different community, and his community has horses. The way you live, the way you think, and the way you believe are all expressed in objects as well as in words. It's much easier for us to understand the language of the objects if the people have written something. But even without writing, and the man I'm talking about who's buried near Beijing, he hasn't written anything, and neither have his people. And yet I can see that what he does every day, what he thinks about, what he believes. And you have to look at a large group. You can't just look at one object. If you look at large groups, you can see that you're looking at people who had two different verbal languages, two different belief systems, and two different languages of objects.
In addition to the language of objects, Professor Rawson also emphasizes the importance of sets. By observing objects in sets, we can learn about the social values they carry.
We all, in our own lives, recognize what is a set and how they fit together, both for daily life and in the past. And for instance, at a Merton dinner at night, you will have not one plate maybe in front of you, but also several knives, several forks, and even a couple of spoons, and then 3 or 4 glasses for different kinds of wine and water. And suddenly you realize that there are different kinds of sets for different situations. So yes, you can certainly look at single objects, and that's what art historians do most of all, but I have moved away from the single object, partly because I think you can overemphasize one bronze, when actually the bronzes were all used in a ceremonial banquet for the ancestors.
Her ability to pinpoint the language of objects is derived from her many years of work experience in the British Museum. It is one of the largest and most well-known museums in the world. With more than 8 million artifacts, it's a mecca for archaeology enthusiasts.
I came here as a very young former student from Cambridge. I didn't know a great deal about China. For someone who's grown up in a society with sculpture, you see these beautiful bronze vessels and you ask yourself, what are they for? The head of the department and the senior curators said to me, well, I think you better go downstairs and find the basement and sort it out. You need to learn, but we need you to get everything in order. So get everything in order, sort it out. I wasn't sure I knew enough. So books, articles, and the great opportunity to handle these bronzes.
In the basement vaults, she spent her days with treasures that were beyond the reach of most people, and the experience expanded her knowledge of Chinese artifacts.
The time at the British Museum was fantastic. I saw all these wonderful objects. I had complete access to the basement. I could look at ceramics, bronzes, jades every day of my life, and I could write about them. And as China opened up, of course, I could go to China. So that in these early years at the British Museum, I was involved in research as much as curatorial work, and as we discussed, I also was involved in developing the galleries.
The longest exhibition hall in the British Museum is the Room 33 for China and South Asia, which houses more than 2,000 artifacts that date from the Neolithic period to the present day. She entered the Department of Oriental Antiquities when she was 23 or 24. As time went by, she began to view the bronze artifacts differently.
I gradually came to see that each period had a type and a style, but much more than that, the bronzes went together in sets. So here we see the beginning of a set. They're slightly varied in date, but they're mostly late Shang dynasty, and they were used not one by one as works of art to put in a case. They were used at banquets for offering to the dead ancestors, and they were not just used in tombs, they were used in life. So they have been examined, and you can find traces of alcohol or traces of bones or grain in them.
After studying the sets of bronze for a long time, Professor Rawson concluded that the quantity, shapes, and decorations of these wares contain important information about society. The bronze from the 9th century BC underwent significant changes. The sets from the Shang dynasty have intricate patterns and come in small quantities. Those from the Western Zhou have simplified patterns and increased in size and number. She believes that the change represents an increase in the number of participants in rituals. Participants in the Western Zhou probably stood further away when the rituals took place, hence the need for larger vessels. The increase in the scale of rituals signifies a change in the social structure of the nobility.
This set, or any set, requires a group of people to handle it. You have to think of them at a banquet with a large altar perhaps, and people lifting the bronzes, offering them to the people present, and thinking and reassuring the dead that they're being thought about. So these bronzes go with movement. They're a set which has a sort of choreography, and the choreography is built into them. They belong to a long culture, a long history, and it's very important that we recognize the importance of that movement, that choreography that used them day by day in ceremonial and religious offerings. They're really important. So that is my first discovery, that in a way we have what I call a language of objects. It's with the discovery that these bronzes of the Shang dynasty need one form of choreography, but then if we look at this little picture here, we find that they're quite of a different shape a few centuries later, and so the choreography has changed. And you can't change the choreography or the order of a ceremonial banquet without someone making a decision. So I discovered that there was, around the 9th century BC in China, in the central Yellow River Basin area, there was a decision made of some sort, one we can't trace in text, but we can see in visual objects, that there was a decision to change the ritual.
从青铜器从物的组合去读出了一个跟文献记载完全不一样的一个西周的一个现象，那就他当时就把它称作为礼仪改革。其实它反映的是一个可能非常激烈的政变，或者是说一个非常不一样的一个政治状况或者是社会状况，特别是青铜器有很多铭文，所以它就是成为在至少宋代以来都被认为是正经补史这样子的一个角色。所以你怎么把青铜器跟这一些文字脉络绑在一起，几千年的文字脉络要脱开。
Her unique perspective and careful observation extend to her study of ornaments. When she was excavating in Jerusalem, she wondered why large quantities of Chinese porcelain would appear in the Middle East. After joining the British Museum, she started to study the exciting history of contact between East and West.
This is where we look at the Silk Road, and this is also one of my early interests, which led to the book called The Lotus and the Dragon. So this Silk Road period, I became very interested in it because I realized that this was part of China's international relations, really. And actually, as we talk more, you'll see one of my big interests is in international relations and how China developed its borders and its contacts with other people.
Professor Rawson studies international relations from the perspective of the exchanges in material culture. For instance, when she saw lotuses on porcelain, she wondered why the lotus stems and leaves appeared in the form of vines, vastly different from the lotus leaves in real life. She traced the source of the ornaments and found that the early Chinese bronze or lacquerwares mostly have on them depictions of dragons, phoenixes, or other animals. Depictions of plants didn't appear until the 6 dynasties and the Tang Dynasty.
它其实是从一个很大的角度去思考这个中国纹饰系统的发展，就是原来的这个纹样到后面就是原来动物纹为主，但是后面才出现这植物纹样。可是你会看到今天我们看到中国纹样很多都是植物纹样嘛，譬如说我们看卷草，日本人称唐草纹，或者是蚕枝莲花、蚕枝牡丹，就是我们看到青花上面这些纹样，我们都觉得是中国。我们知道其实文化交流在譬如说根深蒂固或发展成熟的文明来讲，也不是那么容易。就是你自己有一套系统，你有一套既定的系统，外来的文化其实很难影响到你很多核心的这个部分。那他觉得这个背后的驱动力是佛教的传入，因为佛教传入是一个很强势的宗教的这种还有文化的这种改变，对于中国原来的这个文明。
Features of Western architecture also entered China with the spread of Buddhism. Before that, China did not have structures built from stone or art with a central theme and decorative frames. The Yingang grottos, built in the Northern Wei, bear witness to the appearance of Western architecture in China. They show how the visual systems of the West and the East influenced and merged with each other. By studying the ornaments on Buddhist sculptures, Professor Rawson was able to see cultural exchange between Europe and Asia on a greater scale.
你看佛像或什么，其实我们也不知道艺术家是谁，在中国脉络里面，但是至少大家去围绕那个佛像的演变去做那个解释。这是边饰纹样、建筑上面纹样，根本没有人会去记录。他们到底是怎么传进来，然后怎么演变到我们今天看到，这完全是要依照物或是作品，我们才能够知道。所以他从一个小的破片去看到这个大的世界，所以我觉得这是非常，就是他的很敏锐的观察啦，然后到后面去找寻这个整个解答，而且就是说，他因为在大英博物馆工作，所以他可以看到不是只有中国的东西，而是可以看到印度，然后西亚，然后到整个比如说埃及、希腊、罗马的这些文物，然后串起来。
In her book Chinese Ornament, The Lotus and the Dragon, Professor Rawson outlines a different history of cultural exchanges in Eurasia. She identifies ornaments from the ancient Mediterranean world and how they arrived in Middle Period China through the spread of Buddhism. She describes how Chinese ornamentation, as symbolized by the lotus, traveled westwards with the Mongol conquests in Eurasia and through trade.
Among the many patterns and designs that came from the West to China were these scrolls with big flowers. These are the development of designs that were used in the 8th century in Iran, or 6th and 8th century in Iran, and then in China, and then developed into these wonderful designs on Yuan dynasty blue and white. They're actually not made for China or the West, they're made for the Middle East. So these were exports, and the value is therefore in understanding not just where the designs came from, but how they went back to the area with which they were connected.
Professor Rawson has focused her recent research on horse trade. In ancient times, horses were crucial for facilitating daily activities and assisting in military expeditions. The Chinese traded with peoples in the Les Plateaux, who brought horses from the steppes. She believes that this was the origin of the Silk Road.
China is too hot and too humid to develop very good horses, but so the horses come from the northwest, south of the Gobi Desert, but north of the Tibetan Plateau. And so here we have a horse which is excavated in Central Asia, in fact, in Xinjiang province. And it's the interest in horses and the need for horses that led the Chinese rulers to send people out into what is now Xinjiang province and to put armies there to control the area. And it had a big effect not only on that distant part, but in central China. This very powerful country looked outwards to get things like horses. It paid for them in silk. It paid the army in Xinjiang in silk. And we have good records of that. They brought back to China horses, of course, but also these other ideas, and it greatly enriched China and made it yet more strong in trade.
The excavation of tombs has revealed the remains of horses, horse tack, and decorative grave goods. They helped us reconstruct the story of trade and cultural exchanges.
And here you see particularly beautiful horses, and it shows how valuable they were, that the beauty of the shape of the head, the color of the glaze, the undulation of the body, you don't need just to look at it as a work of art. It tells you that the Chinese of the time valued horses. They were an important element illustrating their status, and they almost certainly came from the West, from Northwest.
Professor Rawson's experience in the British Museum equipped her with the knowledge and perspective needed to give voice to mute objects.
对，他要讲的事情其实是很简单，然后从小的观察，然后到整个，就像他提到，就是说不能只观察一件物嘛，其实要从脉络里面去观察，所以他就是其实是很直接的从作品，然后到物跟物的关系，物跟人的关系，然后对这一整个脉络去进行研究。也许有一些现在都是好像尝试，大家都会去思考这样的问题，可是在那个时代，而且是用物来做研究，然后从小或是可能不是看单件，是看整群，然后整个脉络，其实它算是最早或很早就发展这样子的一种思考或研究方法论的人。
There is a very big picture in Chinese history which shows that they are keen and eager to adopt new innovations from outside, but what they do with them is to make them completely Chinese. So the ornament of the vine is turned into a completely Chinese design on Chinese blue and white porcelain. And the same happens in earlier times. They bring bronze, the metallurgy, from the far west. It comes across the steppe to China, but they don't make it into weapons. In the West, they make into elaborate weapons, but in China, it's made into ritual vessels. And this is one of the main characteristics of China, that it will use things from outside, metallurgy, a technology, or horses and chariots, a technology, but they will use it in their own society, in their own way.
The British Museum undoubtedly played a crucial role in Professor Rawson's academic career. She's both a scholar and a practitioner. She initiated the refurbishment of the China Gallery and curated several exhibitions to show the public the grandeur of Chinese civilization. In the late 1970s, archaeology began developing rapidly in mainland China. As a world-renowned museum, the British Museum became one of the main venues for showcasing Chinese artifacts. Yet in the early days, the Department of Oriental Antiquities was marginalized and received little attention compared to the departments focusing on Greece and Rome.
People who were in the Greek and Roman department really treated me and my subject and my colleagues as though we lived on the edge, on a crust of a piece of bread. They were the bread and we were the crust, and we were unimportant. I don't think that's true anymore. I think, for instance, the big gallery funded by Joseph Hotung made a huge difference. It shows what a beautiful and wonderful culture both China and South Asia have.
Everything changed when a collector made a generous donation. The significance of the Asian collections in the British Museum increased exponentially, and it became more important than ever before.
This is a big Asian gallery which was funded for improvement by Sir Joseph Hotung, and we remember him here with his name for the China and South Asian Gallery. The gallery is as long as a football pitch, and we have renovated it twice in my lifetime.
The latest renovation was completed in 2017. The late Queen Elizabeth II was invited to the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Professor Rawson became the keeper of the Department of Oriental Antiquities in 1987. She has intimate knowledge of every item in the gallery. Her ingenuity is embedded in its decorations and layout, which are quite unique compared to other museums.
One reason to make the crowded case is to make sure that we display as much as possible and all the best pieces. If you were in America, probably also Taiwan, you would only see one piece. And this is a different kind of attitude. We want to show as many pieces with a sense of the grouping, a sense of how they were used, or how they contrast.
Professor Rawson often adopts a comparison approach to see the differences between cultures or the progress from one era to another. It can help us understand objects' unique features and their history. To demonstrate the importance of jade in Chinese culture, she compared it to gold and silver in the West.
In the West, they didn't start with jade. In the West, around the Black Sea in particular, you get early copper, and then you get gold. When it's developed, then the population gets religious ideas attached to it, or they start to think of it as miraculous. And in the case of the West, we definitely like light. You know, you have to think of Northern Europe or Britain. I mean, now you're in the summer, but in the winter it's dark, and we have candles, and if we put the candle in a silver candlestick, it reflects the light and makes it more light. And then light, we have all sorts of words, metaphors, that mean it's a good thing. You know, light-hearted means, you know, enjoying things. Light enlightenment means learning things. So we have a whole language, a verbal language attached to light, and then we have a visual language attached to light. And then the reverse is true. It's different with China. You like it because it's soft. It's hard, really, but it has a soft feeling, and many people wear jade against their skin or hold it in their hands in a pocket. It's a sort of whole social life is developing around these two materials, and it's reinforced by the whole society.
Through her research, Professor Rawson reconstructed the circulation of jade in ancient China. The extensive use of jade shows how important it was to ancient people, although we will probably never learn what jade really meant to them.
The Liangzhou city collapsed. This is probably due to water, and so it was abandoned. But the people who moved took their jades with them, and then copies were made. So these copies come not from Liangzhou, not from the Shanghai, Hangzhou area, but from the northwest, from Gansu province. So the use of these items, these strange shapes, whose purpose we don't know, was spread by the movement of people. And also later, probably by exchanges, by imitations, and they went on being used right down to the 20th century. Nobody knew what they were for, and they acquired new meanings with new people. So what this tells us about objects is that you need to understand them by being part of a society. So what we're looking at are fragments of a religious belief that we can no longer understand. These were obviously important in a sense of how the universe of these people was constructed.
Throughout her 27-year career at the British Museum, Professor Rawson came to believe firmly that learning about objects can help the East and West understand each other. 1994 marked a turning point in Professor Rawson's career. Merton College of the University of Oxford invited her to serve as warden. The University of Oxford consists of 39 colleges and 4 academic divisions. It has educated a wealth of great talent and is considered one of the top universities in the world. Merton College is the oldest and most prestigious college. Founded in 1264, it's known for its outstanding research in mathematics. Professor Rawson became its first female warden in more than 700 years.
This is the oldest building for students in Oxford. And therefore it's the origin not just of Oxford, but of Cambridge, but also Yale, Princeton, all these other universities copied this.
She arrived in a new environment to take up a different post and to take on different challenges. She had to cope with the stress, but the historic chapel and library on campus made her feel at home.
In some ways, the chapel and the library were more familiar to me than much of other aspects of Merton, because I was used to old buildings and had worked in an old building at the British Museum for over 20 years. So they were part of my life that I felt needed to be protected and thought about.
She used the experience she gained at the British Museum to help renovate the chapel.
The chapel is just one of its big jewels. It's a beautiful building, but of course it needs to be looked after. So one of the duties of a head of a college is to be concerned about the chapel. So we had to think about how to raise money, to have a good choir, to build a new organ, but also to restore the glass. Some of the glass had been sent to another cathedral, and I had to get it back to put here in the chapel.
On a stone plaque in the chapel is a list of Merton College's wardens.
I'd been an undergraduate at Cambridge, I'd worked at the British Museum, and here I was in an institution far, far older that went back to 1264. So I appear in this list. It's a long list of wardens, of which my name comes with my year of arrival. And then I had to learn about the college. There were many things that I learned about being head of a college that had nothing to do with teaching. It was to do with being a warden, to be responsible for a whole institution from the chapel down to the youngest and newest undergraduate.
She also put a lot of effort into looking after the Merton College Upper Library. It was built in 1370 and has a collection of more than 12,000 books.
It is the oldest surviving library in Oxford, and in fact, one of the oldest academic libraries in the West. One of the unusual things is that it's still functioning as a library. One of the real important features of Merton is that we have a large collection of our medieval manuscripts, in other words, books that were written by hand in the period before about 1450, 1460 in England. And it gives an idea of what an academic library would have been like.
Medieval libraries operated differently from contemporary ones. The operation was based on people in a community sharing resources with each other.
Books were really valuable, and at that time, not very many people could afford to have their own library that they needed for study. The college set this up in several ways. One was that members of the college, the fellows, were obliged to leave their books to the college when they died. So any books that individuals might own would then become part of the common collection. And for a long time, they referred to this not as a library, but as to the books held in common. So the idea was sharing.
Back then, how to access books in libraries was also different.
And the books were chained with a chain attached to the edge of their binding and the foredge of the book. So you would have to take it off the shelf like that and then put it down on the desk to use it. And this remaining chained book, it happens to be a 17th century architectural book, but it shows how the chaining system worked, and then they would study the book here.
The manuscripts, astronomical instruments, and the way books are laid out in the library transport visitors back to the Middle Ages. However, without the hard work of Professor Rawson and the meticulous care provided by the college, all these historical traces would not have survived to date.
Both the chapel and the library have had many small changes made step by step over the years since 1994 when I came here. So now it has beautiful lighting. It's very carefully looked after by the present librarian and her staff. There are many people who come and visit in tours. It's a completely different place, and the same is true of the chapel. The chapel was completely changed over the time I was there.
As its former warden, Professor Rawson remembers everything about Merton College. She showed the cameraman the monument dedicated to esteemed translators Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang, who translated Hong Lo Meng into English.
In a way, it's one of our main contacts with China. It's not the people here don't remember, but I do, because I knew them, and they were very kind to me.
She was a student here at work.
Yes.
The electronic bulletin board at the entrance of the college displays the news of her Tong Prize Award. Although she's been retired for years, she remains connected to Merton, as if she has never left. Professor Jingfei Shi of the National Taiwan University and curator Xiaoyun Wu of the National Palace Museum were both her students. They learned an unforgettable lesson when they first met Professor Rawson.
我就说我不喜欢研究纹饰是现在那个细节，就花长得怎么样，叶子长得怎么样，我想要看它们的结构关系。然后他就请我喝茶嘛，所以他就马上拿起那个盘子说：“来，你给我讲一下什么叫结构关系。”就有点当场考试，然后就用很破的英文说：“哦，我觉得这个花跟这个叶子，他们应该要找出他们之间的关系。”
我去的时候，他是那个 Merton College 的那个院长，然后同时也是牛津大学的副校长，然后就是他办公室就是一个院长的办公室嘛，然后就觉得还有很多秘书，然后就觉得他超有威严的。然后我也是英文就是可能表达不是很 OK， 然后所以一开始去的时候先被他威仪吓到，然后结果后来就是每天就是支支吾吾，因为可能不是很敢表达，所以就是说到那边大概1个月以后，他有一天就是跟他有那个约导生访谈的时候，他就直接说：“你要回家了吗？”
She's a rigorous researcher and can be quite straightforward. Yet over time, her image transformed from a strict teacher to a loving mother.
他就像妈妈一样照顾你，就是巨细靡遗，你会觉得你很难想象他对学生付出的所有的时间，还有那个感情，食衣住行，其实他都很照顾。他知道可能英国的消费很高或什么，他比如说他要出一本书，他就会自己贴钱让我们去翻译这个，然后就给我们稿费。就是说那一些照顾是非常无形的。
因为如果你有好的想法，他其实是很鼓励你。而且我记得印象最深刻的是，比如说我们在讲到一些很重要学者的想法啊，什么在跟他分享或分析，然后最后他就说：“你以后也会像这些学者一样。”然后觉得哇，让你觉得很受鼓励。
Xiaoyun Wu showed us her PhD thesis. It's a thick volume filled with Professor Rawson's handwritten notes.
你看到他给你写的东西的时候，给你一个感觉，他比你还在乎你的论文，就是他的批判性都是很高的。但是你透过字里行间，你还是可以看到，就是比如说像这边，他就会一开头就会先写出说，那我觉得你一定要。你这个人的最大问题是什么？就会你这边会看到大写的 "Do not"， 就是你不可以怎样，或者是说，有一些他觉得可能不成熟的想法或者什么，你就会像这样得到一个叉叉。对我来说，最珍贵的一个版本就是他给我这个批改的这个版本，所以我就是一直把它放在办公室好好的珍藏。而且我觉得，你每次看到这个的时候，你就会反省自己有没有在那个 check 上面。
She's detail-oriented and a great communicator.
非常喜欢从生活的面向去切入，因为这样子的一个做法，它可以跟你的日常生活马上产生联动，然后听的人他其实马上就有感觉。 所以就是我觉得他是一个非常善于沟通的人，所以也因为他很善于沟通，比如说你在他的文章，你不会看到那种咬牙截句，或是那种咬文嚼字，都是非常简单。我觉得跟他是做 curator 的这个大英的经验非常有关系，因为你要怎么跟进到博物馆的人沟通，你提供的说明版的文字应该是怎么样，是不是什么人他都可以读得懂。
At Merton College, teachers and students learn together and live together. Every evening, walking through the heavy iron door dating back to the 13th century, the warden and professors are seated at the high table at the front end of the hall. Students sit at the long tables to the south of them. The atmosphere in the hall is both solemn and ritualistic. On the walls are portraits of former wardens. As the first female warden, Professor Rawson's portrait stands out. In the portrait, she sits upright with a smile on her face. The porcelain represents her academic prowess.
Being the first woman, I'm different from my predecessor and my successor, and I'm younger than my predecessor, so I belong to a different generation. I don't know how I want to be remembered. What I am remembered for is being energetic, for studying China, and for moving from one generation of older people older than me, to people younger. To be remembered for giving something to the college, for improving it, and perhaps for changing it a bit, but not too much, and, if you like, sending it on into the future stronger, better equipped, and with more people and more money and more development possible.
During her tenure, she won a grant for Oxford from the Leverhulme Trust to fund a 10-year program that supported the study of contemporary China at the university. The program increased the scale of Chinese studies in a substantive way, and also contributed to the establishment of the University of Oxford China Center in 2008. In addition, she led several delegations to China to exchange ideas with local scholars there and foster mutual understanding between China and the UK.
The first of the group trips we made together was to the Hershey Corridor, and maybe that was the most impressive because it was a long trip. We travelled 1,000 kilometres in bus together, and as we went along on the, if you like, the south side was the Tibetan Plateau, and as you know that rises enormously high and is covered in snow, and on the other side is the desert, so that I think this is when I began to see that the contrasts in landscape in China were so important. And also, it was the first trip we made as a joint Chinese-Oxford group, so we were developing with difficulty, if you like, exchanges of ideas. It's not easy to exchange ideas between two completely different academic communities.
China is vast, and geographical factors have a huge impact on the culture of its people. People in different regions speak different dialects, and there are different languages of objects.
Though everybody writes in the same characters, they speak the same language, in fact, each region is different, and in the past, even in my early days, they all spoke different dialects. When I went to my early conferences in China, everybody spoke in their dialects, and I was sitting in a row with my young Chinese friends. I was probably only 30 at the most. My spoken Chinese was very weak. Behind me was a guy speaking with a Fujian accent, and even the Chinese students next to me said, "Oh, I don't understand a single word he says." And so this difference of dialect, this difference of food, the difference of regional history, I think keeps China very diverse.
Despite the language barriers, the archaeological activities proved to be fruitful for the participants.
罗森教老师组织了多次的这个北戴英大学，包括牛津大学这些老师的这个考察活动，去了很多地方，包括中亚，包括蒙古、中国、俄罗斯，然后我们开会。这在他的这种组织和领导下呢，我们这个就是对越来越多的这些物质文化的这个复杂性有了一个深度的认识。当我们看到这个不同的这些因素 在一起的时候，我们才可以就是有机会把这些不同的因素编织在一起，让我们对这个古代的这个人类社会呢有一个更加全面的认识。
During her term of office, she successfully encouraged Oxford to increase its activities in Chinese studies. She also directed many large-scale research projects, increasing the importance of sinology in British and European academia. It seemed she could only get a respite from all the onerous duties when she was back at home. She lives in an old house built in 1860 with a large, lush garden.
For about 10 years I lived in the college. I came here every weekend. I did the garden every weekend, but it's good kind of exercise. I think the book is always in my head, but when I come in the garden, almost I'm just looking at what it looks like. That's what I mainly do. And I try to sit down a bit. My husband always says, don't spend all the time working, sit down and enjoy the garden. And it is extraordinary, really.
The parlor on the ground floor contains bookshelves filled with books in Chinese and English. Professor Rawson reads and receives guests here. The window offers a unique view of the garden. She's dedicated her entire life to studying China. However, recent developments in international affairs have shown that there remains an immense cultural divide between China and the West.
I think that both sides need people like me at all levels who want to understand. I think understanding has been slow and difficult for me. If you say what are the challenges, understanding has been terribly slow. It's taken me 14 years or more to understand as little as I do, and all my colleagues in sinology would say the same. The more you know, the less you know. I think it needs a certain amount of humility on both sides to recognize that they don't know and then set out to know.
She emphasizes that paying attention to China's past will help us understand today's China. Her job has always been about helping the Europeans understand the importance of history and helping the Chinese understand themselves better.